Alright, so we're going to talk today about the ecology of bird populations. Um, this is chapter 13 in your book, and we're going to go over mostly some just sort of fundamental things. I'll deviate a little bit from the book, but not too much, and then give you your discussion question. And this will be a shorter lecture this week. So let's talk about populations in general. First, what is a population? Well, a population is a group of the same species, of individuals of the same species, in the same place and at the same time with the capacity to interbreed. And populations have attributes that we can assign to them that go beyond the attributes of an individual bird. And I should say, I'll be talking about all this in terms of birds, but these ideas apply in all forms of population ecology. Whatever animals you study, for the most part, these ideas apply. They change a bit when you get into certain organisms like maybe some like parthenogenic organisms, some insects, things like that. But the general ideas are still applicable. Actually, if you understand how those things work, then you can kind of take the ideas that are presented in this lecture and think about how they're different in those other groups. So, anyways, we'll talk about it in terms of birds. So, what are some of the attributes that apply at a population level that don't apply at the level of the individual? Well, these are things like how big is the population, how dense is it, that's how many individuals are there per unit area, the birth rate and death rate, the immigration and emigration rate, and the age structure and the sex ratio. And we're going to talk about several of these things today to varying levels. Usually, when we are talking about a population, the thing that we talk about the most is just how many individuals are there. That's the size. But all of these things are important. Um, Demographics is an important part of understanding populations, and demographics are the statistical characters of populations based on those various attributes. And we'll take a look here in a bit at some demographics. These are things like the age structure of the population. Um, Demographics are affected both by biotic factors and abiotic factors. Now, biotic factors mean other living organisms. So, an example of a biotic factor that would affect the demographics of a population might be the predator abundance in an area. On the other hand, abiotic factors are the sort of non-living components of the environment that affect the structure of the population. And so a wildfire is an abiotic factor because it is a non-living thing that phenomenon that will affect a population as a wildfire moves through an area, right? By killing some individuals. Populations are affected by two different types of factors: density independent and density dependent factors. And in retrospect, I wish I hadn't put the word regulating on this slide. We'll go with it. You'll understand why I say that later. For now, just understand population size is affected by density independent and density dependent factors. Ignore the word regulating. So density independent factors are any factors that limit the size of a population that doesn't depend on the number of individuals in the population. So something that affects the number of individuals in the population that does not have a change in its effect as the population increases or decreases, a direct change. So if you imagine as an abiotic example, a severe storm kills a large number of birds in a population. The severity of the storm doesn't change with the number of birds in the population, right? It's not like the storm would get less severe and kill fewer birds if the population was smaller proportionally relative to a large population where there were more birds. The storm doesn't care about the number of birds in the population. It just does its action completely independently of the size of that population. um, Density-dependent factors are exactly the opposite of density-independent factors. These are environmental factors that limit the size of a population where the effect of that factor varies with the size of the population. So an example of this would be limited breeding territories. Let's imagine a landscape, and let's just keep the numbers very simple. Let's say there are 10 breeding territories on a habitat patch. And we have two individuals, or two breeding pairs in the habitat. There's no issue there. But what will happen as more and more individuals come into the space is eventually breeding territories will run out. And particularly if there's difference in the quality of those breeding territories, quality breeding territories will run out even faster. And competition will increase. And ultimately you'll be completely maxed out on breeding territories. This is a density-dependent factor. The intensity of the effect is dependent upon how many individuals are in the space. And so that's sort of the difference between density-independent and dependent factors. So population trends vary across space and time, even within a year. If you think about seasonality, the number of individuals in a population changes throughout seasons. It changes throughout years, and of course it changes as you move across a landscape. And so abundance or population size is typically cyclical and often tracks food sources. An example of this would be barn owls. I don't have a graph for that here because your book doesn't provide a graph, but if you look at barn owls and voles, specifically this example from the book was from Scotland, but this is true of in general of predator-prey relationships. If you imagine a graph, when the number of prey items increases over time, right? This can't happen instantly. There has to be breeding, there has to be time moving forward as individuals are produced within the prey population. So as that number moving through time starts to go up and up and up, the predators, in this case the barn owls, because more resources are available, are able to raise more young. And so trailing right behind the increasing line of prey items is an increasing line of predator items. Now, what happens is at some point, the number of predators, gets very, very high, and the pressure on the prey item, the voles in this case, gets to be too much, and it starts to drive the vole population back down. Well, of course, what's going to happen to the predator, the barn owl, when the prey item, the vole population drops? The response will be a lagging decline in barn owls and predators. And as they decline, the pressure on the voles decreases and the voles start to increase again, and the cycle renews itself. So you have a sort of delayed response between predator and prey interactions that is cyclical and causes two undulating lines that represent abundance over time. That is the very typical model of predator-prey interactions. If we look at some examples here of cyclical uh, cyclical abundance in animals. You see the red grouse graph here. And with red grouse, you have population cycles that are typically about 3 years in duration. So that's why you see here you've got peaks and troughs across this time window from 1890 to 1980. So quite a data set. That's a long data set. Um, and the interactions that are driving that could be things like parasites, predators, food, abiotic conditions. There's many different things potentially that are driving these pulses um, and then creating this flux. And B, you can see what is essentially a long-term population increase. Population was very, very low in the European shag in the 40s and slowly increases over time, and then it seems to sort of plateau and reach a stable point that looks kind of similar to the red grouse graph as you get into the mid 80s and early 1990s. The graph C, the great tit graph, is showing what we might consider very high fluctuations. There's a lot of noise in that graph, but an overall upward trend, which is what that dotted line represents. And then in the bearded reading graph here, you see places where the blue arrows that are pointing down at the top of the graph represent, if I recall, severe winters. And you see that those winters sort of line up with places where there are declines in the population abundance. So when we talk about populations, there's a few different ways to think about them. You can think of a population as just like all of the individuals. That really doesn't paint a very clear picture of how populations actually work, because typically, because our world is a sort of patchwork of anthropogenically manipulated landscapes and less, none of them are unmanipulated, but far less manipulated landscapes, more natural landscapes, we have a very patchy land overall. And so what we create are patches of habitats that are suitable to some specific species. And those patches of habitats have various levels of connectivity. And so connectivity is just the ability of individuals to move from one habitat patch into another. And each of these patches can represent a discrete population. But it's not really discrete because there's some movement between them. This idea of these somewhat discrete patches that have some amount of connectivity between them is called a metapopulation. So each of these represents discrete populations with some amount of connectivity. How are they connected? Well, via immigrant and emigrant behavior, leaving or entering. Birds move in between these spaces, becoming new breeding individuals within one of these patches. Patches in your book, as far as I know, doesn't talk about this at all, so I will talk about it in simple terms. These patches, if they are net producers, so they have high birth rates and low death rates, so they end up making more individuals in a season than they do lose individuals. They will likely have high immigration rates as those patches fill up and competition drives dispersal. And they will act as sources of individuals for other discrete populations. So if you look at this central patch here, this central population is a source, because all these, and not just, wouldn't have to be all of them, but all of these adjacent patches have connectivity to it where birds from this patch leave and go to these other patches. So it's a source of individuals to all these other patches. Note that for many of these other patches, let's just use this one first. We have this as another source. Birds can move in both directions. This is not a unidirectional connectivity, a unidirectional connection, I should say. It is bidirectional. This is a source, and so it can pass to our original source we're talking about, and of course the original source can pass to it. Now, from this source, let's look at something different. We have some unidirectional arrows, and they go to sinks. So what a sink is the opposite of a source. It is a region that ultimately pulls individuals from sources, but doesn't itself act as a source. It doesn't produce an abundance of individuals that then will disperse to other locations. Sinks that do not have source connectivity are, typically going to be destined to disappear entirely because they need individuals from outside the sink to continue to replenish that population. And note, I like the way this figure has depicted this because you have sources in the core and sinks around the periphery, and that's typically what we think of as a source-sink dynamic. It's not always true. There are exceptions to this, but as a general rule, you think of like you have a core habitat, and within that core habitat, you have high productivity, so you have lots of offspring being produced every year, and they're going to some of them will disperse outward from that, filling in further and further away from the core. And as you get away from the core, you get into less adequate habitat and more into eventually sink sorts of populations. So that's the difference here. Sources send individuals to other sources and sinks. Sinks take individuals away. And this whole thing is called a metapopulation. So each one of these blobs represents a population. The totality of this represents your metapopulation. Now let's talk a little bit about demography here. So here we have well, first let's just talk about age structure. So age structure is very important in determining the birth rate. That might not be initially obvious, but it'll make sense in a second. You're like, well, individuals can breed, so what's the age structure matter? But if you think about it, young birds are sort of naive birds. They're not experienced. And so they aren't very good in that first year, or depending on the age, depending on the age of sexual maturity in the bird, this can change. But in the first attempt at mating, young birds aren't very successful at attracting mates. They're not good at defending their territory, and their inexperience makes them poor at rearing offspring. So that means if you have a demographic structure where most of the individuals in this population are very young, you're going to have less successful breeding, which means less births compared to deaths. At the same time, I should say, young birds, like first year birds, for example, a large percentage of them tend to die. So age structure is very, very important in determining the birth rate. Here we have a Bullock's Oriole. And if you look at Bullock's Orioles and you look at the comparison of young and older males, you would see that they fledge the same number of offspring. So superficially, it would look like young and old males are equally successful in fledging offspring. But if you look at the genetic composition of the offspring that they fledge, you would see a very different story. In young males, the offspring they fledge are 71% extracopulatory babies. In other words, the female that male had paired up with mated with another male, or maybe even a couple other males, and laid, and those males were older birds, and laid those eggs. And so many of the young that the Bullock's Oriole was responsible for fledging actually came from other males, and they're not from its own genetic lineage. Now, if you look at the same sort of thing, but you look at it in older Bullock's Oriole males, they only have about 32% of their offspring coming from extra pair copulation. So in that sense, the older males are much more successful in raising their own offspring than the younger males are. Another important thing is survivorship. Seasonal shifts in population size do occur. Like I mentioned earlier, if you look across seasons, population changes over seasons, and young birds are not very good at dealing with harsh conditions. They're not experienced. They may not, in that first year of life, let's say, if we're talking about a warbler, they may not have been able to get the fat reserves that they needed to survive. Things like that can occur. And so younger birds tend to die. The relative proportion of young birds dying to old birds is very skewed toward young birds in a given season. So that's another way that age structure is important here. And then at the extreme other end, right? So we've got young birds versus old birds. But what we didn't talk about is really old birds. Really old birds will undergo senescence. This is just the way our elderly loved ones go through senescence. Old birds become physically less able to do the things they need to do. Along with that, they become physiologically less able. Their reproductive performance drops dramatically. All those things happen as they get very old. So birds toward the end of their life, much like elderly humans, become much less capable. And so as a result of that, those very, very old birds may be poorly equipped to produce viable young, which means they don't contribute much to birth rates. So very young and very old birds don't contribute much to birth rates in a population. It's experienced older birds up to a certain point that are primarily responsible for increasing birth rates and increasing population size. Sex ratio. So in general, if you look across the broad array of the 10,000 or so species of birds that exist, the populations typically hold a sex ratio that is 1 to 1. And so a guy named Fisher wrote a lot about this in, I want to say the mid 1900s, but I can't actually remember when he was writing. And so let's just look at what Fisher had to say here. First, he said, because all sexually reproducing species have one mother and one father, the average benefit of producing a male is identical to that of producing a female. Simply saying that, like, whether I have a male offspring or a female offspring, they're the same likelihood of them then going and passing on their genes, because all individuals that will be born in the future have to have a mother and a father. It's a pretty straightforward idea. But from this idea comes Fisher's principle that the amount of resources expended on producing males and females should be equal across the population, with the caveat that is as long as the cost of producing both sexes is the same. So because you get the same benefit from producing a male and a female, the amount of effort expended should be the same by a parent, right? Whether I'm making a male offspring or a female offspring, my effort will be similar. But again, that caveat is very important, as long as the cost of producing male and female offspring is the same. So, when does that break down? Well, it breaks down a lot, actually. And so, despite most birds being very close to 1-to-1 sex ratio, there are plenty of examples where that's not the case. Many raptors, for example, such as this Harris's hawk, have females that are larger than males. And in a Harris hawk in particular, but in many of these raptors, the size difference is really obvious even as hatchlings. So even as soon as these birds hatch, the female, you can tell a female from a male if you're experienced just by looking at the size of the individuals. Now, obviously, there's variability in bird size, so it's not perfect, but in general, the females are bigger. Now, because of that, because you have a larger female, that female requires more parental investment, and literally they have to feed her more because she has a larger body to be maintained and to grow. So what this means is that this high investment that's required in females ultimately means that more males can be produced for the same amount of effort. So, like, for the same amount of food, and which of course equates to hunting effort, I can produce more males than females. So what this means is that the sex ratio in Harris's hawks and other hawks as well will become skewed toward males because they're easier to make. It's as simple as that. It's literally easier to make male babies than females. So you'll have more male babies than females. So this is a place where sexual dimorphism, that is the size between males and females of the offspring, drives a shift in the sex ratio of the population. Life history. So life history traits are all very important in these discussions of populations and demography, etc. Life history traits are just traits that directly influence an individual bird's survival and reproduction. So we're looking at an individual level. Some of these things are really obvious. Things like lifespan and age of reproduction. Also things like clutch size, clutches per season, etc. These life history traits vary among individuals in a population, and so they can be influenced by local environments. In other words, at the local level, depending on, let's say, resource availability, clutch size might be different. These are not static traits. Occasionally, one of them might be. Like, there are some birds that they just lay one egg all the time. Actually, we're going to look at an example of a bird that very typically would just lay 2 eggs here in a minute. But in general, these characteristics vary, and the environment has a strong influence on those characteristics. The traits vary allometrically, that is with body size. So what this means is that, and this is across different species, larger birds will lay larger eggs, they'll have longer incubation periods, they'll have longer lifespans, etc. So if you compare very large birds to very small birds, these are trends that you can typically expect to happen. There are exceptions where maybe a smaller bird has an unexpectedly long incubation time, for example. Another important aspect is that these traits are interconnected. Life history traits all sort of meld together to create kind of one story about an individual. And because they're all interconnected, they have trade-offs. As you adjust one life history trait, say one increases, another will decrease. So, for example, maybe clutch size increases. Maybe we want to increase clutch size. So instead of laying 1 egg, we're going to lay 5 eggs. But maybe that's incredibly demanding, as it very well may be. So maybe whereas I used to have one egg but two clutches per season, now I only do one clutch per season. There are going to be trade-offs as these values get tinkered with. If you can imagine sort of a spreadsheet with all these values in it, and as you adjust one value and it goes up, another value somewhere goes down. That's how I could explain it best. Ultimately, as we adjust those values in our imaginary spreadsheet, um, they have a tremendous impact on the fitness of these different birds. So this is a black-legged kittiwake. There's a seabird. They look a lot like gulls. Uh, they usually raise two chicks. They usually have two eggs. And some researchers went in and did an experiment where they either added an egg to a nest or took away an egg. And what they found was that chick weight and fledgling success were lower when there were 3 eggs, and that no parent was able to successfully raise 3 young to fledging. In other words, at least one young would die if they added a third egg. Additionally, females that tried to raise 3 chicks had lower survival through the seasons into the next breeding season. So you had a lot more females with 3 eggs that didn't make it because of the energy expenditure taken to raise or attempt to raise 3 young. This very easily shows trade-offs between life history traits and the interconnectedness, right? This literally is affecting the longevity of the adults, the adult females at least in this case, by showing that extra energy expenditure during the breeding season caused higher mortality in the non-breeding season. That's what I meant when I say as you increase one number somewhere on our imaginary spreadsheet, another number goes down. In this case, we increased the number of eggs in the nest, and the probability of survival went down. So because of the way we can manipulate these values, and we can't do it, evolution manipulates these values. Life history traits and these trade-offs drive the evolution of species in one of 2 directions. And this is, I don't love this model, but it's a very classic ecological model and way to think about birds and other animals in terms of these trade-offs. But you can think of this as a spectrum. And on one side of the spectrum, you have R-selected species. R-selected species are species that are short-lived but produce generally more offspring. So something like a Carolina chickadee is an example of an R-selected species. They don't live particularly long, but they have numerous offspring per clutch. K-selected species are long-lived species that have small clutches, so they're just the opposite. So something like albatrosses, which can live to be 50 years old or something. I don't know what the longest lived albatross is off the top of my head, but they can live a very long time. But have very, very small clutches and even skip some breeding years. So you have these 2 ends of a spectrum. I don't live that long and I make a lot of babies while I'm alive, or during each breeding season, I should say. Or I live a long time, but I make fewer babies per breeding season. That's a trade-off, right? R versus K. Lots of birds, rather than taking the chickadee or the albatross approach, fall somewhere in the middle, where maybe I live longer than a chickadee, less than an albatross, and produce less eggs than a chickadee, but more than an albatross. So they sit in the middle of this spectrum. And there's no right answer to what the best strategy is. These are just different life history strategies. Okay, that brings us to the discussion question, which I have to talk slightly about limitation and regulation first. So populations are controlled ultimately by population limitation and population regulation. Limitation are density dependent and density independent, or I should say, or density independent processes that set the carrying capacity of a population. Now, we haven't talked about carrying capacity, but carrying capacity is the maximum population that can be sustained indefinitely, based on the resources that are available in a given location. That could be how much food is available, how much water is available, what space is available, in terms of breeding spaces or foraging spaces, whatever. That's limitation. Sort of sets like your upper threshold. Regulation is a feedback mechanism. That's entirely density dependent. This is why I said earlier, ignore the word regulating on those slides, because I didn't want you to confuse it with this. Regulation, population regulation, is explicitly feedback through density dependent processes, and that creates a stable population over time. So if you think about, just as if you recall, we talked about the barn owls and the voles and the feedback loops. As one population increased, the other increased, and then vice versa. It kind of went back and forth, back and forth. That's a feedback loop, right? It's what causes the fluctuations in the population. So if you imagine this carrying capacity set by population limiting factors, and it's set at some level, let's say it's at 100 individuals, and you imagine over time the population increasing up to that carrying capacity, it doesn't just hit 100 individuals and stay perfectly flat and stable at 100. What actually happens is that you have all sorts of processes occurring that can affect that population. You have density dependent and independent processes, and ultimately the density dependent processes create the fluctuation, the feedback loop that hovers around the carrying capacity. Essentially, as a population reaches its carrying capacity, it tends to fluctuate around it. It actually goes above the carrying capacity sometimes, but of course, because it's extended beyond the carrying capacity of the space, it must be driven back down again. The resources are not available to sustain the population above the line. So, it could be food availability, and of course that means that some individuals will starve and the population will decrease again. This is population regulation. So what do you have to do with this limitation regulation thing? You need to choose a species of interest. I don't care, any avian species of interest. So you have to choose a bird and write a paragraph covering its general life history and natural history, just briefly, like what kind of habitat does it live in, what are its food resources, is it more like toward an R or K selected type of life history strategy? Just because that's an important part, you have to understand that to answer the next part. You have to think about those things and then write a couple paragraphs that cover what sort of limiting and regulating factors, or you might think of this as what density dependent and density independent processes might be controlling population size for that species. So in a given space, what things could change or somehow impact that species. Some easy things that you can look at and think about is like, if I know that I'm talking about a species that eats fruit, well, then I know that these fruits that are very important to that species, as there are fluctuations in the environment with that fruit availability, that availability is going to drive seasonal differences in how many individuals in that population could be sustained. So that's one thing you could talk about. What you cannot do is just give generic statements in this discussion. You can't say food availability is a limiting factor. You must be more specific than that. Now, to some extent, this is hypothetical, right? I'm not asking you to go out and research a real population. That's not the point. The point is to think about the life history and natural history of an organism, of a bird, and then think about what factors might change a population of that species. Um, if that species that you chose has some very specific breeding habitat requirements, that might be something that, if limited, would affect the population size. And so you can talk about what that looks like. Why might that get limited, and how might that affect the species? That is the point of the discussion question. Look at the life history and natural history and connect it to density dependent and independent factors. Now, density independent factors might be more difficult for you to think about. You're like, I think density dependent factors are fairly easy to wrap our brains around, but doing this with density independent factors maybe isn't. But a good example, let's say you have a western chaparral species. So the chaparral is a sort of scrubby environment, scrubby ecosystem in like Southern California. And the plants in the chaparral, many of them are essentially designed to burn. It is a part of that ecosystem's natural function to burn. And so you might talk about how manipulation of that system and the wildfires in that system might affect the population of your bird that's living in that chaparral. That could be an idea. You might have a species that lives on an island or several islands that are prone to hurricanes, and how hurricanes and climate change that is going to influence the frequency of severe storms could ultimately affect the population. Those are some examples. And then for your responses, you just have to compare your species and the limiting and regulating sort of ideas that your colleagues have presented with your own. Just compare. Okay, that's everything. If you have any questions, reach out to me.